All right, here we go. 5758 practice quiz. On this practice quiz, we're going to be using the quadratic formula and completing the square. And we need to remember that when we're doing this, this will be on your test as well. There should be no decimals in your answers. Fractions, simplified square roots, no decimals. But yeah, so let's go ahead and jump into this and get started. First thing we need to do when we are solving by completing the square, which is how we will solve these first 5 problems, we need to get our x terms on one side, and then we need to get our other number on the other side. So I'm going to start this off by subtracting 5 from both sides. All right, so on my left side I have x squared plus 8x, and then I'm going to do a plus, leave a space. Right hand side equals -5, and again I got to do my plus, leave a space. So I'm going to come over here off to the side, and I'm going to take my middle number, which is b, and I'm going to say 8, and I'm going to divide that by 2. We always take our middle number divided by 2 and then square it. And then remember, that middle number, whatever we got there before we squared it, will show up in our next step. So we want to just write it, or at least make a note of it, okay? So that's not necessary, but it does help you in your next step. So first of all, we need to add 16 to both sides here. 16, 16. All right, so that allows us to factor this left-hand side. And we're going to do x, and then squared. And then what goes in this little space right here is what we got right here. So that's a +4. So we're going to do plus 4. Right-hand side, -5 plus 16 is just 11. Once we get to this point, we have 2 things we need to do before we look at simplifying. The first thing is get rid of your squared. So we got to take a square root, and we need to do that to both sides because it's an equation. So get rid of your squared, get rid of this. They are inverses, so they cancel each other out. And then we also need to remember that whenever you put a square root symbol in your problem, you need a plus or minus symbol. Last step we need to do here is subtract 4 to the other side. So -4 on both sides. 4 minus 4 is 0. Final answer, x equals -4 plus or minus square root of 11. And that is your final answer here. Square root 11 does not simplify, so that is your final answer. All right, moving along to number 2. We are going to start this out the exact same way. Subtract 10 from both sides. So we end up with, left-hand side, we have x squared plus 16x. And then again, we got to do our plus, leave a space. Right-hand side, we have a -10 plus, leave a space. So come up here, we're going to take our middle number, 16, divide it by 2, and then square it. So we get 16 divided by 2 is now 8. Squared gives me 64. And again, that 64 is what goes in this space here. The 8 we will use in our next step. So we got x plus, we leave a space, squared. I shouldn't even have wrote that plus in there, but I know it's a +8, so x plus 8. Right-hand side, -10 plus 64 is 54. So next step, what we're going to do is get rid of our squared. So we got to do a square root. So we square root both sides. Squaring a square root are inverses. Again, they're opposites. You usually call them opposites, but they are inverses. That's what allows us to cancel those out. Right-hand side, plus or minus square root of 54. And what I'm going to do is, before I look at simplifying anything, I'm going to move this 8 over. So I'm going to subtract 8. So we end up with x equals -8 plus or minus square root of 54. Now, before I say that this is my final answer, I'm going to come over here off to the side, and I'm going to look at my factor tree for 54 and just see, is there something that I can divide out of this that will help me to, simplify this further. So I'm looking for pairs, or I'm looking for perfect squares or something like that. So 54 is 2 times 27. That's one way to look at it. And then 27, we could take 27. 3 is divisible by 27. So we have 3 and 9. And then 9 is 3 and 3. So what we recognize here is that I have a pair of 3s, and I often like to circle 3s that are not right next to each other. or not necessarily just 3's, but circle any number that is not right next to its pair, just so you know that they don't have to be right next to each other in your factor tree. They can be anywhere. So my final answer here, I have x equals -8 plus or minus. Now I had a pair of 3's, so that, remember, that comes out as 1, 3. And then the stuff that didn't have a pair gets multiplied back together and left under my square root. So 2 times 3 is 6. So that will stay under your square root. So that is your final answer for this one. And remember, this is your last step. We have to make sure that we're doing this. We have to double check our square roots and see, does it simplify further with your factor tree? All right, next up. Now we get into some messy stuff here. So this is already set up for us. We didn't have to move that over. But what we do need to have to do completing the square is we need to have this x squared by itself. So I'm going to divide everything by 5. And then I'll be ready. So x squared plus 7 over 5x plus, and then I'm going to leave a space, equals 7 over 5 plus, leave a space. All right, now again, just remember, use your calculator for this. You'll be allowed to use your calculator on the whole thing. Even though you shouldn't be ending up with decimals, it's definitely going to help you do some things here with your, because you got to take 7 over 5, we got to divide that by 2, and then we need to square it. So, you know, we're ending up with fractions dividing by numbers and all that other good stuff that's happening in there. So just follow along with me here and make sure that you are getting this answer. So we're going to take our middle number, which is 7 over 5, and we're going to divide that by 2 and then square it. And again, just like before, I want to plug this into my calculator and get a number before I square it. So go ahead and do that. 7 divided by 5 divided by 2. However you're doing that, again, your calculators may vary slightly, but either way, you should end up with a 7 over 10. And then we'll square that. So 7 squared is 49, 10 squared is 100. So that's what we'll plug in here. 49 over 100. And we'll plug that in over here as well. 49 over 100. All right, now for the next part, I want to rewrite this. So I'm going to do x, again, leave a space, squared. What goes in that space right there is this right here. Oops, I didn't want that to be in black. There we go. I wanted to stand out a little better, which is 7 over 10. I know that kind of looks like a 7 over 16, but 7 over 10. Right-hand side, add those together. Again, use your calculator. You get 189 divided by 100. All right, so next up, we are going to take the square root of both sides. Excuse me. Take the square root of both sides. So we have x plus 7 over 10 equals, need your plus or minus. I'll look at the square root of 189 off. Actually, let me just do that now here real quick. Let me take this off to the side. So 189, again, it's a bigger number. We're not overly familiar with this maybe, so just start dividing numbers until you find something that works. It is divisible by 3. It's also divisible by 9. So 9 will give me 3 and 3, which is my pair that I'll pull out. 21 is 3 times 7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pair of 3's and I'll pull 1 out. Oops, changed back to blue for some reason. There we go. And then these two I'll multiply back together to get 21. So that is going to give me, again, a pair of 3's comes out as a 3. Multiply the other two back together. So this is 3 times 7. It's going to give me 21. And then we will have this all over. The square root of 100 is 10. Okay, so let me move this up a little bit. Last step, we need to subtract 7 over 10 from both sides to get our final answer. And also, I want to remind you that you have the option of putting these together into one fraction, but that's not what we need to do. What we need to do is just, get our answer here. But if you are fine leaving it like this, I'm fine with that as well. They do have a common denominator of 10, so you could combine them together. But this is fine. I'm okay with you leaving it like this. So that's good for your final answer. All right, next up, number 4. Same thing, we need to start this off by dividing out a 3. We have to get that x squared by itself. So we're going to divide everything by 3. So x squared minus x, I'm still doing my plus, leave a space. 7 over 3, just leave it as 7 over 3. We don't want to use mixed numbers or decimals. Just leave it as an improper fraction. Take our middle number, which there's nothing visible, but that just means there's a 1. So we take our middle number, which is 1, we divide it by 2, and then we'll square it. And since 1 over 2 doesn't really reduce or anything, I'll just square them. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4. So this will actually be the number that we use in our next step because it didn't simplify at all. In this step, we're using the 1/4. So we're going to have a 1 over 4 here, and we're going to have a 1 over 4 here. So x, leave a space, squared. Actually, let me come back up here because this part right here, we still end up with a 1/4. That's okay. But this part up here should have been a negative 1 divided by 2. Okay, we still end up with a 1/4, but down in here, this should be a minus 1/2. Equals, let's see, 7 over 3, excuse me, 7 over 3 plus 1 over 4. Plug that in. You should end up with 31 over 12. Okay, 31 over 12. And then we do our square root. Square root. Left-hand side, I have x minus 1/2. Right-hand side, I have plus or minus. Square root of 31 does not reduce, but the square root of 12, if we pull that off to the side here, 12, we have 2 and 6, 2 and 3. So I do have a pair of 2's that will come out. Okay, so that's going to be 2, square root of 3. And again, as far as rationalizing the denominator and stuff, we'll get into that stuff later on. For now, I'm okay with you just leaving it like that. Just understand, later on down the road, you may have a teacher that is a little more picky about that. Right now, I'm trying to test the simplifying the square process, not necessarily like all of that rationalizing and whatnot. So I'm okay if you leave it like that, but just understand, somewhere down the line, you may have someone that is not going to be okay with that. Okay, so there's our final answer for this one. Next up, and last one in our completing the square. Started off the same way. We need to get the x squared by itself. So divide everything by 5. We have x squared minus 7 over 5, which is nice because we actually already did that one. So we should get a similar number on that side. The right-hand side is going to be different, but so here we go. Take your middle number, which is, I won't forget my negative this time, so negative 7 over 5. And then we're going to divide that by 2. And then square it. So this one, let's clean it up here. So negative 7 over 10. And then square it. We'll still get the same thing we had before, which is 49 over 100. So plug that in here. 49 over 100. And our next step, we'll use that number before we squared it. So we'll come back up to that. Okay, so here we go. X minus 7 over 10 squared equals right-hand side. Let's see what we get over here. So again, break out your calculator. Do 9 over 5, or 9 divided by 5, plus 49 over 100. And if you're using the TI 83, 84s that I provided you, remember to use that math button on the left-hand side, math, and then you want to change it to a fraction. So you should end up with 229 divided by 100. So 229 divided by 100. Okay, so we are going to take a square root. Next step, take a square root of both sides. So x minus 7 over 10. Sorry, my handwriting seems to be getting worse. On the right-hand side, if we take 229 off to the side, you're going to run through some factors there. You know, maybe you divide by 9 or 16 or 4 or whatever, you're not going to really find anything for that. So we're going to leave that as square root of 229. And the square root of 100 is 10. And we don't want to forget our plus or minus out front. Last thing we need to do is add the 7 over 10 over to the other side. So add 7 over 10. There we go. These are gone. X equals 7 over 10 plus or minus square root of 229 over 10. All right, so those are all of the completing the square problems. And again, your test will be just like that. You will need to have the first 5 completed using completing the square. The last 5, you complete those using the quadratic formula. All right, so that's what we're going to get into here. You will have the formula provided for you. I just need to see you use the formula correctly. So let's start off by making a list. A is -3, B is -10, and C is also -3. So here's your quadratic formula. I'm going to just start off by replacing all of my variables with parentheses, and that will help me to avoid the double negative mistakes that happen a lot and often is the biggest area where students lose points. So we want to avoid that, and there's a really easy way to avoid that, and that's just by throwing in parentheses even when they are not necessary. So first up, let me change up my color here, make it stand out a little better. So we have negative b is -10. Oops, there we go. -10. Over here we got a -10 again. 4 times a is -3, and c is also a -3. On the bottom, a is -3. So x, we got a double negative to start it off with, so that's just a +10. And we're going to plug in, remember all of this stuff that's under the square root, that is what we plug into our calculator. So we're not actually plugging in the square root symbol into our calculator. We just want to plug in the stuff that's underneath it, and then we'll see if it simplifies. Okay, so you should end up with 64 underneath your square root, and that's divided by -6. So this we end up with 10 plus or minus, the square root of 64 is one of those nice ones. So we're going to end up with square root of 64 is just 8, and this is all over 6. I'm sorry, -6. So 2 options for our final answer here. These are all divisible by 2. So we could write this as 5 plus or minus 4 all over -3. Or this is the same thing as -5 plus or minus 4 all over 3. Either one of those would be acceptable answers. I'm not picky about that. Whether you divided a -2 out or a +2 out, doesn't really matter to me. So either of those are acceptable. All right, here we go. Next one, again, started off by making a list. A is 1, B is -8, and C is -9. So quadratic formula. I'm just going to replace everything with parentheses again, just like I did in that last one. So we got b squared minus 4 times a times c. All of this is over 2 times a. All right, I'm going to change up my color again just so it stands out a little nicer. So negative b is -8. b is -8 squared minus 4 times a is 1, and c is a -9. 2 times a is 1. So x is, x is equal to minus a -8, that's a +8, plus or minus. Again, in my calculator, I'm doing -8 in parentheses squared minus 4 times, you don't really need a times 1 because that's not going to change it, but just good habit to be in. 4 times 1 times -9, you end up with square root of 100. This is all over 2. So that will obviously simplify. We got another perfect square in there. Square root of 100 is just 10 divided by 2. So final answer, 4 plus or minus 5. And you can leave it like that. You could also do, 4 plus 5 is 9. 4 minus 5 is -1. You could do that if you wanted to, but I'm okay if you just leave it like that. That's fine. Next up, number 8. again, make a list. A is 4, B equals 7, and C equals -3. Quadratic formula, x equals, you probably have done this so many times now that you're like, all right, I already know this. This is, kind of getting a little redundant, but again, I just want to make sure we really drive the point home here and you understand that, this is basically your last resort in solving quadratic equations if nothing else works. This will always work, okay? Quadratic equation will always work, no matter what. All right, so B is 7. Oops, I don't know why that did that. B squared minus 4 times A times C is -3 over 2 times A is 4. So x equals -7 plus or minus square root. Let's see what we get here. So let's plug this in. We end up with 7 squared minus 4 times -3. Plug it all in. I got 97, which is nice because square root of 97 does not reduce. That is a prime number. So that's your final answer there. We didn't really have a whole lot to do after plugging in our numbers, so that's it. All right, 2 more left. Next up, A is 5, B is 8. I'm sorry, -8. C is 1. So quadratic formula. Let's see what we get here. X equals -b plus or minus square root. We got a b squared. We got a minus a 4ac all under the root. And the denominator, we end up with 2 times a. So what do we got here? So b is B is a -8. We got a -8 here. 4 times A is 5, and C is 1. All over 2 times A is 5. So we got a minus a -8 again, so that's a +8. Plus or minus square root. Let's see what we get under here. We have -8 squared. Make sure you put that in parentheses, because otherwise you'll end up with a -64, and we don't want that. We want, actually, it's going to be a +64 minus 20, so you end up with 44 here. Okay, you end up with a 44 under your square root. 2 times 5 on the denominator gives me 10. Now, 44 is not a perfect square, but it does simplify because we have 4 times 11. 4 is 2 times 2, so there's actually a pair of 2's that we can pull out here, and then this 11 will stay underneath. Okay, so again, just like with your completing this square, you have to make sure you do that last step. Double check to see if it simplifies before we call it our final answer. So we had a pair of 2's that can come out. The 11 stays underneath, all over 10. And then the last thing we need to do is check all of our numbers that are on the outside. Again, we don't look at the number on the inside, just the numbers on the outside, and see if they are all divisible by the same number. These are all divisible by 2. Sorry, not 3. 2. These are all divisible by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so we don't need that there, just square root 11. And 10 divided by 2 is a 5. So that is your final answer. And again, you have to double check after you simplify your square root. Just see, does your overall fraction simplify? All right, so next up and last problem. These have to be all on the same side, or you at least need to recognize that it's going to be the opposite sign when you move it over. So if you do not move it over, just remember that C is a -4, but I would suggest just moving it over. It doesn't take that long, and a lot of times it will help you. This kind of looks like a 9. So A is 4, B is a -7, and C is a -4. All right, so here we go. X equals, one more time, -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all under the square root. And my denominator is 2 times a. So let's plug in what we got here. B is a -7. We got a -7. 4 times a is 4. C is a -4, and a is 4. So x equals, we have a positive 7 plus or minus square root. Let's see what we get underneath our square root here. And again, one more time, I just want to remind you, put that negative 7 in parentheses. Excuse me, so you don't miss a negative in there and then end up with an incorrect answer. So you should end up with, I got a 113 under here. 113. All of this is over 8. Excuse me. So x equals, well, I don't even need to rewrite it. I don't know why I was going to try and rewrite something there. That's your final answer. We can't do anything with that. All right, so again, if you have any questions, I know this is not a typical way to go over a review, but if you have any questions on this, please just let me know, and I will get back to you. But yeah, just let me know if you have questions, and